On the 5th of July 2024, Keir Starmer walked into Downing Street with one of the largest majorities in British political history. Just over 2 years later, he's gone. Not voted out, not defeated in an election. Pushed out by his own party, replaced by a man who wasn't even sitting in Parliament 2 months ago. His replacement, Andy Burnham, was confirmed as Prime Minister this past Monday, the 20th of July 2026, making him the 7th person to hold the office in just 10 years. 7 Prime Ministers, 10 years, and a king who's on his 4th leader before he's even finished unpacking. The only person, or rather the only resident of Downing Street, who's outlasted all of them is Larry the Cat, Chief Mouser to the Cabinet Office, who was pictured sitting on the doorstep of number 10 on Monday, watching yet another Prime Minister move out. Larry has been in post since February 2011, under David Cameron, which makes Burnham the 7th Prime Minister he's outlasted. Starmer barely made it to 2 years. This is the autopsy of a premiership that started with a landslide and ended in barely 2 years. And it's the story of why Britain seemingly can't hold on to a Prime Minister anymore, even as its most famous cat sails on completely unbothered. To understand how Starmer died, you have to understand how he was born, politically speaking. In July 2024, Labour won a landslide, over 400 seats. 14 years of Conservative government ended in a single night. It should have been the start of a decade of dominance, but there was a problem baked into the result from day one: Labour's vote share. They'd won a massive majority off roughly a third of the popular vote, the lowest share ever recorded for a majority government of that size. The opposition vote had simply splintered between the Conservatives, Reform and others, letting Labour through the middle in seat after seat. That's not a strong mandate, that's a landslide built on sand, and sand doesn't hold when the weather turns. Starmer knew the economy was fragile, he knew the public finances were strained. What he perhaps underestimated was how quickly patience would run out, because within 18 months Labour's polling had collapsed from that 34% election share down into the high teens, running neck and neck with the Conservative Party that had just suffered its worst defeat in history, when both governing party and opposition are polling around 17 to 19%. That's not a two-party system anymore. That's a warning sign. Every autopsy needs a cause of death. With Starmer, there wasn't one single wound. It was death by 1,000 cuts. Let's go through them. Cut 1. The chaos at the top. Less than 3 months into government, Starmer's own Chief of Staff, Sue Gray, resigned amid reports of infighting within his top team. She was replaced by Morgan McSweeney, the strategist widely credited with actually winning Starmer the election in the first place. Then, in 2026, McSweeney went too. So did his Director of Communications. When the people who built your election, win and run your government, start heading for the exits, that's not noise. That's structural failure. Cut 2. The economy never turned the corner. Starmer entered 2026, promising a renewal, a New Year video pledging to bring down the cost of living and get Britain back on track. It's the kind of thing every struggling leader says. And just like every struggling leader who says it, the country didn't feel it. The cost of living crisis Labour inherited was still the cost of living crisis voters were living through 18 months later. Cut 3. Scandal. Every fading government eventually gets its scandal, and Starmer's came wrapped around his relationship with disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein's associate Peter Mandelson. It gave Labour's own backbenchers, including previously loyal figures, the opening they needed to say publicly what they'd been saying privately, that Starmer had made too many mistakes. Cut 4. The rise of reform. While Labour bled support from the left, Nigel Farage's Reform UK was hoovering it up from the right and from disillusioned former Conservatives. A governing party being squeezed from both directions at once, with its own MPs watching Reform's poll numbers climb, is a governing party whose backbenchers start doing career math. And in the Labour Party, when enough MPs start doing that math, leaders don't survive it. Cut 5. There was finally a credible alternative. For most of Starmer's premiership, plotting against him was mostly just noise, because there was no obvious replacement willing to move. That changed the moment Andy Burnham, the sitting mayor of Greater Manchester, popular, telegenic, and outside the Westminster bubble that voters had grown to distrust, signalled he wanted back in. Burnham stood down as mayor to fight a by-election in Makerfield, Greater Manchester, in June 2026. He won comfortably. Within days he was sworn in as an MP for the first time in a decade, and within a week of that, Starmer had announced his resignation. That is not a coincidence. That is cause and effect.
I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty.
On the 22nd of June 2026, Starmer stood in front of the cameras and gave the kind of speech every departing leader gives. Heavy on dignity, light on specifics. Every decision I have taken has been about putting the country I love first, he said, his voice audibly catching. That is why I will resign. It's worth pausing on how this actually happened constitutionally, because it's easy to assume a Prime Minister resigning means a general election. It doesn't. Britain doesn't directly elect its Prime Minister, yet the public elects local MPs, and whoever commands a majority in the House of Commons as leader of their party gets to form a government. That means a governing party can swap its leader, and therefore its Prime Minister entirely legally without ever going back to the country. Farage seized on exactly this point, calling it ridiculous that Westminster wants to crown Andy Burnham off the back of a single by-election and demanding a fresh general election. He didn't get one, because under this system he doesn't get a vote on it at all. Starmer set out the timetable himself. Nominations would open on the 9th of July and close a week later. Nobody credible stood against Burnham. He was confirmed as Labour leader on the 17th of July, making Starmer, at just 2 years, the shortest-serving Labour Prime Minister in history, and on Monday, the 20th of July, he officially became Prime Minister, travelling to Buckingham Palace to kiss hands with King Charles III. So, who actually inherited this mess? Andy Burnham isn't a new face. He's a recycled one, and that's largely the point. He served as a minister under both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown in the 2000s, then spent almost a decade away from Westminster entirely as Mayor of Greater Manchester, a role that earned him the nickname the King of the North for his combative, high-profile clashes with central government, most famously during the pandemic, when he publicly fought Westminster over funding for his region. That distance from Westminster is precisely his appeal. Burnham gets to walk into Downing Street as the insider's outsider, a former minister with a track record, but not tangled up in the last 2 years of Starmer's collapse. He's also, by most accounts, tried this before. This is being described as his third serious attempt at Labour's top job, after unsuccessful leadership bids in 2010 and 2015. What does he actually stand for? Burnham has pitched himself as further to the left than Starmer, promising to put the cost of living crisis front and centre of government, and arguing Britain has surrendered too much control over sectors like housing and energy to the market. He's popular with trade unions and the party's soft left. Whether that translates into a functioning government is the open question, because as one Washington Post piece bluntly put it, he takes office with little foreign policy experience beyond trade missions to China and a fondness for Texan music festivals, and immediately has to deal with an unpredictable Trump White House. Here's the thing about autopsies. Sometimes you can already see the difference between the patient and whoever's standing over the table next. In his first days in office, Burnham hasn't wasted time. He's capped bus fares. He's removed VAT from electricity bills. He's cut business rates for pubs. Reportedly enjoying a pint himself to mark the announcement, he's launched something called Number 10 North, a new Manchester-based government office designed to physically move an arm of Whitehall out of London, which he insists isn't a gimmick, but a real shift of power toward the regions. He's already had a call with Donald Trump, who he's invited to the UK, and he's promised to end rough sleeping and to honour Britain's existing defence commitments. None of that fixes the economy overnight. He's already had to rule out an immediate rise to the tax-free personal allowance, and a policy of rent freezes got shot down by his own housing secretary within the same week. This isn't a miracle cure. It's a Prime Minister front-loading visible, easy to explain wins. But that's precisely the point, and precisely the contrast with Starmer. Voters didn't necessarily turn on Starmer over one single failure. They turned on him because, 18 months in, the cost of living crisis he'd promised to fix still didn't feel any different. Burnham's entire opening pitch has been, watch me move fast on the exact things Starmer talked about but never delivered. Whether that's a genuine change in governing style or simply a new Prime Minister spending his one guaranteed period of goodwill before reality catches up. That's the question this video keeps circling back to. Because it's worth remembering, Burnham has said in his own words that Labour will get no second chances. He wasn't just talking about the country. He knows exactly what happened to the last person who sat in that chair. And this is where the story becomes genuinely remarkable. Not politically, but constitutionally. Queen Elizabeth II reigned for 70 years. 70 years. In that time, she worked with 15 different prime ministers, starting with Winston Churchill in 1951 and ending with Liz Truss, whom she appointed just 2 days before her death in September 2022. 15. Prime ministers across 7 decades works out to roughly one every 4.5 years on average, and even that average is skewed by the fact some, like Thatcher and Blair, served a decade or more each. King Charles III became monarch in September 2022. That's not quite 4 years ago. His prime ministers in order are Liz Truss, who he inherited and who lasted a matter of weeks, Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, and now Andy Burnham. 4 prime ministers, under 4 years. Put another way, it took his mother roughly 17.5 years, on average, to get through 4 prime ministers in the middle of her reign. Charles has done it in under 4. This isn't really a story about the monarchy. Charles doesn't choose these people, and constitutionally he stays scrupulously out of it, but it's the clearest possible illustration of just how unstable British politics has become. So what's the actual disease here, if we're doing this properly as an autopsy? It's tempting to blame any one prime minister individually, Starmer's handling of the economy, Truss's mini-budget, Johnson's scandals. But when the same outcome, an early forced departure, happens 6 times in a row across 2 different parties, that's not 6 separate personal failures. That's a system producing the same result over and over. A few forces are doing the damage. Fractured public support means governments can win huge majorities on small vote shares, which looks like strength but is actually fragility. There's no deep well of goodwill to draw on when things get hard. A brutally unforgiving media and social media cycle turns every misstep into an existential crisis within days, not months, and parties themselves have become quicker to conclude that swapping the leader is easier than fixing the actual problems voters are angry about. Even though, as this current cycle shows, it rarely works, and the search for the next scapegoat usually starts again within a year or 2. Burnham inherits all of that. Not just a country with a cost of living crisis, not just a fractious Labour Party. He inherits a political culture that has, functionally, forgotten how to let a Prime Minister finish the job. So, Keir Starmer, landslide winner, 2 years in the job, gone. Andy Burnham, once mayor, twice a failed leadership candidate, now the 7th Prime Minister of the last decade, already moving fast on the small stuff, still facing every big problem that buried his predecessor, and having kissed hands on Monday with a king who's already on to his 4th leader in under 4 years. Whether Burnham breaks that cycle, or simply becomes the next name on an increasingly long list, is the story we'll be watching over the next few years. If you want to see how this compares to the Truss autopsy, or how Britain's revolving door stacks up against other countries, let me know in the comments. That might be the next one on the table.